You are listening to Decoding Impact, a podcast by Sattva Knowledge Institute, hosted by Ratish Balakrishnan.
Welcome to Season 2 of Decoding Impact. Every fortnight, we will engage leading thinkers and practitioners to understand what it takes to solve systemic problems at scale. For all the curious change makers committed to understanding the trade-offs and incentives to make this world a better place, this one's for you. India is in the middle of a digital revolution. Digital public goods and infrastructures, otherwise referred to as DPGs and DPIs, are at the forefront of this revolution. Given my own experience with DPGs, I've often recognized that the challenge is not in building the DPG. It is in imagining the right DPGs. How do we find that one component that once put in place can unlock population scale value for so many people? How do you engineer and architect solutions that can work at scale? I had a chance to sit with Dr. Pramod Varma, a true innovator and a leader who is the chief architect behind initiatives such as Aadhaar, eSign, Digital Locker, and UPI. And my greatest takeaway from the conversation was that simplicity is indeed the ultimate sophistication. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did.
In the history of humanity, we have had structures that was meant for public goods.
I've always understood DPIs and DPGs from an entrepreneur's mindset.
There is a significant mental model difference for the people who are builders of the DPI or builders of the infrastructure. So what success of infrastructure is not impact success, it's an adoption success. And diverse adoption, better.
One of the biggest concerns philanthropy has, built into its design in some sense, is the risk of non-adoption.
I think infrastructure builders should ask very, very basic questions.
What is the bus list of a DPI thinking in India today?
DPI thinking, DPI commitment does not take deep pockets, it takes deep conviction.
But I do also believe that there needs to be an entrepreneur for the infrastructure also.
Does Digital India actually solve poor people's problems?
In the last few years, there has been an emergence of DPGs and DPIs to achieve population scale social impact. 1.36 billion Aadhaars have been issued and have been used for 82 billion authentications. There have also been 100 lakh crores of rupees of value transactions in the last 8 months through UPI. In addition to identity and financial inclusion, there are multiple DPIs emerging across education, health, agriculture, skilling, and livelihoods. So what will it take to unlock value from DPGs and DPIs as they emerge in other important and complex social sectors today? To enrich this discussion with his insights and to decode DPGs and DPIs, we are joined by Dr. Pramod Varma. He is the current CTO of EkStep, a not-for-profit creating a learner-centric, technology-enabled platform to provide learning opportunities to 200 million children in India. Among his many avatars, he is also an advisor of national and global repute with a personal passion for technology, science, society, and teaching. Pramod, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here, Ratish.
Pramod, one of my big goals for today's podcast is to build on the amazing conversations you've already had on videos, podcasts on digital public infrastructure and digital public goods. But there are probably a few people who are joining us in this conversation for the first time. So if you can help us understand what is a digital public infrastructure, what is a digital public good, that will be a great starting point.
I think, first of all, these terms are somewhat new. And I think they're still being defined, frankly speaking. But I think that there's been a reasonable, consistent usage of these terms in the last 1 year, if you look at it. And the G20 conversations and other global conversations is cementing those definitions to make it easier for everybody to say the same thing. Let's start from digital public infrastructure. Countries, as long as we had organized societies in the history of humanity, we have had structures that was meant for public goods, whether it's roads, whether it's plumbing or water supply, in ancient Rome or wherever, right? People had. So this is not a new concept for us. Idea of creating infrastructure, a shared infrastructure that brings some sort of common access or meant for public usage purpose, so meant as a public good in one sense. Doesn't mean it's free, by the way. A lot of confusion. A public good doesn't mean it's built by public money, but as meant to be a public utility, meant for as a public good, for creating equitable access, so that people who reasonable balancing out, or the people who have and don't have, they are all able to use it commonly. And we see this all the time. And why do we do this? We always did this for creating equity, creating economic growth, creating enhancing access to water, access to education, access to knowledge, access to music. We had public music programs, or festivals and so on. A lot of these are actually meant as public infrastructure. But interestingly so, and if you look at the railroads of UK, although it might not have started with good intent, definitely it became a economic transport of economic activities that over the rails. And in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, when the highway infrastructure was built in the US, US just propelled itself to that. And now China, if you look at massive infrastructure, and India, in the last few years, our Prime Minister been pushing for dramatic enhancements of physical infrastructure, whether it's electricity, EV, as we were just talking about, or highways, or better rail connections and better air. Is to create that economic activity on top of that. But when it comes to digital, early days of digitization, we had universities like DARPA or defense research related activities that in turn brings out technologies that touch humanity at scale, and the standards bodies and so on worked on it. Universities worked on it. Defense scientists worked on it. And internet is a classic example of a human scale digital public infrastructure. It is not controlled by one company. It's not if you, Ratish, your podcast, you have a lot of followers, you are king on the internet. There's nothing stopping you from anyone from anywhere in the world to come to your website or podcast site, or and to consume content. So the underlying infrastructure was decentralized, made available as public good, public infrastructure, for utility purposes. Not only that, on top of that, you then allow innovation to thrive. So when you create digital public infrastructure, you have to think about two things. One, creation of that digital infrastructure that sort of levels out the access and equity angle to it. But it also, you have to consider the second point, the most important point, that is it amenable to innovation further? Because that triggers exponential change later. And so we saw internet, and we saw things like email protocol that allowed us to communicate over email. And then we saw GPS in 1999, when GPS was put out in the public domain. It became a public utility. And actually DPI became a DPI. And each of those DPI did one thing very well, but at scale. That internet by itself, all it did is to move information packet, HTTP protocol and HTML packets. That's literally they did. They didn't talk about how e-commerce will work, how we will have this podcast over Zoom. They didn't come in the way of being opinionated about it. They said, all we do is this, but very well at scale. And GPS said, all we are doing is three numbers, lat, long, alt, right? As in third variable. All you're saying is here, this is the location of that particular object or a person. That's it. Nothing else on top of it. All such innovations are layered on top of it. And that's why it was unimaginable. There's a funny story that mostly stories. The guy who built GPS or been part of the GPS creation was flying, and somebody was sitting next to him and said, "What do you do?" He said, "Okay, we are we are just creating something called GPS, global positioning, massive infrastructure. What does it do? It says, oh, tell you exactly where you are. The other guy looks, thinks for a while and says, I already know where I am. I don't understand the value of GPS at all. But this is why it's very hard to imagine all possibilities that will happen on top of a DPI if designed well. So digital public infrastructure has that. But what is unfortunate though is that post 90s, the standard bodies or research organizations were too slow compared to the technology firms, mostly driven by US. They were way too fast. So if you look at technology infrastructure beyond the internet and GPS, the economy on the GPS were all private goods. They were not public goods. If you look at cloud, smartphones, platform economy, two-sided platform economies like Uber, Amazon, Airbnbs of the world, they're all private goods. Nothing wrong. They truly reimagine possibilities. They helped us reimagine how things could work. But it has its own negative effect that we are not building enough digital public infrastructure beyond the internet. And digital public goods, very quickly, is just set of passive assets that help someone else build DPI. So if you have standards or software or knowledge assets that can be put out in the open source, it simply allows different countries and different jurisdictions to create their own DPIs faster, cheaper. Otherwise, everybody has to create their own DPI from scratch, and that doesn't make sense. So DPGs are just public goods, assets that can be used to build your own house.
Pramod, I think two thoughts that emerged from my, from what you said, and both of them I'd love to have build on, from our conversation. I've always understood DPIs and DPGs from an entrepreneur's mindset, Pramod, because I always say that an entrepreneur is somebody who solves a problem in a way that is viable and effective, right? Like it has to make economic sense and it has to make social sense. And I've realized that the entrepreneurs have a very low chance of success because they basically have to solve a lot of problems. Every time we build a good infrastructure, we make it easier for an entrepreneur to solve a problem. Imagine Ford had to build roads for them to sell cars, right? Or somebody had to create posts to actually do things and so on. I think a good infrastructure helps increase the chance of entrepreneurs succeeding. And when entrepreneurs succeed, value gets unlocked. And for me, the intuitive thinking of infrastructure always is anything that enables problem solvers or entrepreneurs to succeed better, because you create a ramp on which they can run, is good for the society. And digital public infrastructure is a great way to build ramps for more entrepreneurs to succeed.
This is the dilemma we sometimes face. When you build infrastructure, for the new entrepreneur, it sounds, perfect. I always wished there was roads, there was enough capacity and all that thing. Now I can actually build the car, right? In the sense, now it's perfect timing. Society is ready, infrastructure is ready. I can go all out, which is what companies like PhonePe did on UPI, or Zerodha did on top of India Stack, and there's all brilliant examples of that. So there is a disruption coming, and they start seeing the disruption coming, and so people who are incumbents find a little bit hard to reimagine what else could they do, because their mental model and the organization DNA and their current revenue model drives from the current context. And the current context, if you're trying to disrupt the current context, it's not fun for them.
And it is not, and I want to come to that, one is, as you rightly said, the mental model, which is what Henry Ford said. If I had asked you what you want, you will tell me a faster car. Faster horse. You will never tell me a car. But the second is they've built these moats, which is helping them succeed, and infrastructure takes away those moats. Now anyone can drive there, which is, I think, important. So then the moat becomes something else, So if everybody had ONDC, the best e-commerce company is going to differentiate on customer service, not on logistics networks in some form, right? Like I think, and I want to come to this innovators dilemma problem, right? Like what happens to existing incumbents and what is the tensions in there. But the second thing, Pramod, which I think is the even more important point that you made, a road is not designed for a certain type of car or a certain type of bike, a certain type of anything. It is designed for anyone to go. I feel that in social problems, it's very hard to imagine a road model, right? Because everybody wants to build the road, build the car, build the passenger, provide the customer service, and then run. And I've always realized that thinking on DPGs is thought of as a digital problem. I don't think it is a digital problem. It is the mindset problem, saying, how do you imagine building a road and not the person who's driving the car? Because almost everyone who comes in the impact space mentally or subconsciously wants to be the person who's driving the car, right? And imagines building the road as part of driving the car. Do you see that a lot in your experience as well?
A lot. Not even driving the car. They want to be driving the car, actually takes the lady from this place to the hospital and provide healthcare and actually make sure she's okay, right? In the sense that actual true impact in, example, where you are really, really helping someone change their life, which is good, which is very important to think about. No question about it. Why do we build infrastructure? Somebody is not thinking about impact and solution. So it's not to diminish the value of thinking, but there are two kinds of people. There are two kinds of funders. There's two kinds of entrepreneurs or social builders. I call builders. Someone who funds and builds specific solutions that solve something today for a particular well-defined population, or other set of people who funds and builds infrastructure that allows the rest of the people to solve faster, cheaper. Now, we are talking about the latter. We are talking about the idea of DPI. First of all, the idea is DPI is a way of thinking. It is not software. If you think you can outsource it to some IT guys, you totally miss the point. Okay, DPI is not something you can outsource to an IT guy. You have to think about technology as a lever. And then you have to say, if these are the large kind of problems we are seeing, what is that you as an infrastructure builder can build, fund and build so that it gets extremely efficient, fast, high trust, cheaper, faster for the rest of the people to solve. Now, it's difficult in the philanthropic space because most funders want to solve it. Okay, so, and they want a brand visibility and they want. So my recommendation always been that divide the fund into two. Infrastructure fund, different mental model, different brand value compared to the actual solution funds where you give actual mosquito net to people who have, problem with malaria. I think you have to do both, because if you build the road and nobody to build the car and nobody to take the lady from one place to other place or deliver food across the road, what's the use of building the road? So you need both. But actually, the real question is that there is a significant mental model difference for the people who are builders of the DPI or builders of the infrastructure, where the infrastructure game, there are a few characteristics different. One, you can't do impact analysis, RCT on an infrastructure in a hurry. Maybe you can do, I don't know, how do you do RCT of internet? Or how do you do RCT or something so broad? Even economists struggle to do to causation and to find, is the economic growth due to internet actually or internet plus plus plus? There are many combined causes. What is it? How do you attribute to a specific one? We find it hard. For infrastructure, it's very, very hard to actually do. There is methods that we can learn from the public physical infrastructure world, and we could apply some of that in thing. So point number one, if you're separate the fund, infrastructure fund, and the people who are funding have a DNA of an infrastructure builder and not a solution builder. This is point number one. Point number two, don't try to do in a hurry, ask for RCT and impact and so on. Rather, use for adoption of the infrastructure for the next layer of innovation. So you ask a different kind of number. How many people are innovating on top of this? What kind of innovation are you seeing? So you need to create new set of metrics. That, for example, do you attribute to purely Aadhaar or financial inclusion? Or Aadhaar was just one of the of course, it created that impetus for us to be able to push through. But that plus banking readiness, plus Jandhan, plus regulatory readiness, many things, plus geo connectivity, and many things would have happened together to say, oh, now suddenly we have 500 million people doing digital payments and 900 million accounts. Never had that kind of number of bank accounts in 10 years, right? So we did that, but is Aadhaar alone responsible? Very hard. But you ask a reverse question. So one of the two metrics you can do is that, first of all, when you define infrastructure, create a new team, a new funding, and ask different set of metrics. Adoption of the infrastructure metrics, not impact metrics. Adoption of infrastructure and usage every day. And the diversity of that adoption. Two things you can ask. Is it being adopted? Is it diverse in adopted in diverse? That truly tells you that infrastructure is truly becoming a building block that's going to start powering a lot of other things like GPS. Is GPS used here? Oh, here it's used here, it's used here, it's used here. Okay, now I am starting to see the power of infrastructure. The third, you have to have patience as well. You can't have, go to a village, put the infrastructure, see if that woman's life is changing. No, it's not going to happen. It typically takes about 4-5 years. Now, you can have intermediate success. I'm not saying you can't have. It's extremely essential that every country that looks for DPIs have to have yearly success story to tell. Now, it might be things like Prime Minister launching. Good. Launch means what? Something. Launch, announcement. Then next year, okay, there is something happening. Or the next, because neither bureaucrats nor politicians have patience to wait for 5 years. Some visionary may have it. Few visionaries will still see the value. But I think we still need to give them success. So what success of infrastructure is not impact success. It's an adoption success. And diverse adoption, better. So that's a metric you need to put together. So have separate funding, have separate teams, and separate set of metrics for infrastructure funding.
One of the biggest concerns philanthropy has, built into its design in some sense, is the risk of non-adoption. Because many times we take solutions to poor, hoping that is a solution they want, and they often throw it out saying, no, this is not what I want. And then we spend a lot of money trying to convince them that this is what you want, and then they still don't take it up. So there is a real risk in philanthropy always that, hey, are we wasting money on something that's not required? And hence, when you build a road, the first question that a philanthropist is asking is, maybe they don't need a road. Maybe we think they need a road. How do we know they need a road? So show me that vehicles are moving. Show me health outcomes are improving. And hence, the second part you mentioned about demonstrating adoption, I think is very, very critical because people have to use the road. I'll just take an example. We built the Life Skills Collaborative as an initiative where one of the ideas we had was a glossary of life skills terms. It doesn't improve life skills. It doesn't make the state better. It's just a glossary. Today, 2 years down the line, that's the most downloaded used product we have because people found use cases for it that we didn't even imagine, right? But it's a leap of faith to say, hey, they will use it, things will come, etc. And exactly what I wanted to come to, which is, how do you know that is the infrastructure we need? Because that thinking, knowing what part of it to build, I think is really a challenge. Even we've tried to work on a couple of our own projects where we struggled with what is the infrastructure element. So how do you think about that?
So I think a few things. One, unbundling core elements into infrastructure elements is when you do that, it's not coming from thin air. It's coming from very, very clear understanding of today's use cases. This is what happens in, let's say, in the case of identity. When we did identity, it was very, very clear to us that every scheme in a social benefit schemes or every one of these government funded programs would have to figure out who the individual is, whether the individual is entitled to do so, and how do you distribute this to the individual. And then how do you measure that distribution and observe to make sure everything is being distributed correctly? And if you start looking at it and you will start really looking at even bottom line, they would say, oh, identifying an individual. Before that, individual has to fill a form. And that form will need to be submitted. A form will ask for some ID card. We were analyzing this. This is very, very evident to us, for example, that identity as a natural building block or KYC as a natural building block. Or in the case of, when you look at healthcare, we are looking at healthcare data as an underlying infrastructure, personal data for myself. And today we analyze two things that we analyze. We analyze the use cases, many use cases, not one. That's a very bad setup to do one, okay, when you do infrastructure. You have to do 4-5 distinct large use cases and say all of them have what is in common. Second thing you do So one is the analysis of actual use cases and unbundling to say what is in common in all these things. I saw this building, I saw this house, I saw this. It's obvious what is common when you analyze it in systematic. Second, you ask the next set of questions. If you were to reimagine that block differently, and then you have a lot of what's called conversations. We have the amount of conversations we have before we decide to go down a DPI route with civil society and individuals and people and thought leaders and politicians and bureaucrats is a number of conversations. And this is one of those things a lot of us say that we are at that time a shameless student trying to figure out what is it really is our belief that if you do this will change. Is it true? Are we resonating this value? So we are trying to figure out the value unlocking question, right? We believe it will unlock the value, but we have to stress test that assumption by asking, this is second phase. Third, we almost always pre-identify who are the potential adopters of these DPIs. We are not saying we'll build a DPI and they will come. No, no, no. In 2011 and 2010, when the Aadhaar was launched in 2010, by 2011, Nandan was in front of the Reserve Bank of India team. And he was in front of every one of them saying that, will you open a no account? They said, no, we won't open the account. And literally they said, no, why should we open? We already have KYC. No, what is Aadhaar? Explain to me what is Aadhaar. Things like that. Then he goes back again. Make sure he really goes back and says, what if we do this digitally? And by then this is a fourth point, but these conversations and early adopter selection is very, very key, because adoption has to come on the day infrastructure is coming alive, not in future. Adoption must start. Otherwise, you miss the point of analysis of adoption. It may not scale on the same day, but adoption must start. Okay, that is very, very important. For that, you have to have both conversations. Knowledge level conversations about asking whether this hypothesis is true or not. And second is the adopter saying that if I give you, will you actually commit to use it? As a committed adopter is very, very, very important for early days. So before you get the road, you have to get real understanding of the economic transactions will happen on top of that. Let's say you're building some digital infrastructure like electricity. You have to really know, is the industry ready with bulbs? So there is a lot of that conversation happen to say, okay, if you are putting electricity, the first use case is not some mixie or a fridge, maybe just light. That is the first use case. Let's find that killer use case, what's called killer use case, get that going. Then the third aspect of it, even all is done before infrastructure is built. And the third aspect is what's called a plus one thinking. Plus one thinking is where we talk about readiness of usage by the people, by the industry who support the people. For example, if you are doing electricity grid, everybody says, yeah, if only I had light, I would use it. I'm committed to use light. And I will invest. If you get me lights, I am a buyer. Government or somebody would say, in these schools or in these public places, I'll light up. So first use case, I'll commit, But there's no industry to build bulbs. Then what's the use? So that's a plus one thing. Plus one thinking, you're also analyzing. Is the bulb industry ready? Is people ready? Is people's understanding of using of electricity ready? Is the wiring, cabling, electric distribution guys ready? So we have to analyze the distribution and the support ecosystem readiness. That is what's called plus one thinking, including people's behavior. A lot of times we ask this, for example, in education, example is parents for small children have an absolute mental model that smartphone means not education. Smartphone means games. Smartphone means stupidity, nothing to do with learning. Textbooks mean learning. Book, you open book, look at mental model. Oh, my child is sitting in front of a book. Very good, very good. But look at mental models of parents. So there is a natural resistance that will come when you try to push. So we have to analyze the plus one readiness as well. So we have to do these three things. One, unbundling of the problem very, very, very clearly to understand what is common and generalizable. Second, the hypothesis vetting and early committed customer selection. And the third is full analysis of all stakeholders, including stakeholders who are going to oppose you. very good study. It's absolutely worth saying who is going to unionize against you. Yeah, literally, right? I mean, if the horse guys are going to unionize against you, you can't bulldoze your way through. Maybe you have to bring buses first as automobile. Because horse guys will say, yeah, bus is not competing with me, no? Not a problem. The bus will become van and then become car, and then eventually the car will come, right? But if you take on exactly what horse carriage does, then you are literally asking for an uprising of the current society, right? But there are alternate automobiles you can bring, nothing wrong, which will eventually lead to a car. Yeah, because you have to study this very carefully, because this is what, if you try to do it with farming, you look at the farm laws, and you will see the massive pushback, and then you have to backpedal and waste your time. You have to understand a lot of that upfront.
Pramod, this is gold, in my opinion. Right? For me, I'm an engineer. So if you give me a step-by-step approach, I'm like, yeah, this is exactly what I want. To play back to you for one concrete example, how this can be done, to make sure that I have understood it right, and also for the listeners to actually see how it gets played out. I'm making this up on the fly, so you have to correct me when I'm going wrong, right? So I'm going to take agriculture as an example. I'm going to say that everyone worries about farmers being economically, sustainable, because 51% of our population, 15% of GDP. And let's say I want to make farmers sustainable. I'll take one use case, which is a credit use case, and say that, hey, what is required in the credit? Then I take the climate disaster, which actually is impacting farmers. How do we look at reparation, anything that we provide to farmers? Then I'm looking at use cases of productivity, farm improvement, throughput improvement, etc. And let's say across all of these use cases, what I'm recognizing is that if we truly know the quality and the status of the land and the agroclimatic conditions of a farmer, I can give him better credit, I can give him better benefits, I can give him better farm inputs, etc. And we say that is the unit. Let's say the land as a unit, and the data about the land as a unit, and the agroclimatic conditions, which is really the common piece. And multiple use cases, from climate disasters to this. So that's number one. And if I know that, and if I can flesh it out, saying, okay, I'm going to create a digital public infrastructure that helps understand for any farmer anywhere what is the quality piece of land, agroclimatic conditions where they're operating, is step one. Step two is, now I go to banks and tell them that, will you be able to provide loans if I provide you this information? Let's say the people are trying to build the digital public infrastructure. Let's say there is this consortium of stakeholders. But I think bringing a set of people who deeply care about it and building this infrastructure, they go to, so the Nandan equivalent of this case. Right? And the banks say, yes, if you give me this information. And let's say we go to the National Disaster Management Authority, we say, okay, any climate disaster led, like a flood repayment, we will do it based on land quality, etc. Then I have to come back to the third step to say, do we have satellite imagery that can actually tell us some of this information? Do we have apps that can use this information to provide better input data? Do we have credit applications, fintech solutions that can use this data, etc.? Do we have the downstream, upstream solutions, all of that? If the answer to all of these three things is yes, that if land and land data is actually helpful, B, if the primary providers are adopters on day one, and see if the fintech providers, satellite imagery providers, all of them are useful, then maybe there is a case. Maybe there's a 20% chance of success. Have I got this right, or am I thinking some of these wrong?
You're thinking too complex. I'll tell you why. I can't comprehend, even as an architect, I can't comprehend half of this. So reason why is this. DPI thinking is about few necessary building block, but you already are thinking sufficiency. It's not, so problem is necessary condition and sufficient condition. You are in the solution mindset. You are not in a digital public infrastructure mindset. I said, screw a satellite data, screw everything else. Do you know if the farmer is even alive and genuine? Point number one. Okay, now we can say, okay, of course, Aadhaar is there. So in India, it's not so bad. In other countries, we need identity at least. Okay, let's solve that. I'm not at all worried about credit. I'm not worried about satellite data. I'm not worried about anything. You ask a reverse question. I'll take an example of Ford, who said once, right? If somebody asked him, if you train all your employees so well, are you sure you're going to get a better productive, very, very productive, in a good labor force? And wouldn't they quit? He said, I would rather have educated employees leaving me than dumb employees staying back. Okay, it's because he was thinking necessary condition. Ask the reverse question. If I don't educate my employee, you are guaranteed to fail. Okay, let's start from there. Okay. Now, so doesn't mean you are guaranteed to succeed if you educate the employees. That's where the sufficient, lot of us get stuck on the sufficiency. Will it actually solve? But what will happen? You complicate so much that we don't end up doing anything. You ask necessary condition. Can we make sure everybody has an identity? Can we make sure everybody has a bank account? So if you really look at banks, we don't ask these questions so complex to banks and all that. Okay, I don't ask anything. This is too complex. We unbundle, look for necessary building block, not sufficiency. Never sufficiency. If you are in the sufficiency mode, you are in the impact mode. You are in solution building mode. You have to solve it. If you are in a necessary building block mode, you are in infrastructure mode, where you are saying, without it, you're screwed anyway. So let's start from giving obvious things to people. Not doing it is a guarantee of a disaster. Okay. So we have to do what is necessary conditions. It's very, very important for us to be able to think about that. It is important that if you're a builder of infrastructure, you don't ask obvious questions. Obvious question, you will get obvious answer. You will say, if I give you all the data, will you give lending? You say, of course, I'll give you. Then you say, why are you not giving today? You say, no, but then you ask question, what is the process of giving today? Then you say, yeah, we collect all these papers. Then somebody goes home, somebody goes and verifies. We send some surveyor, to the farm, because nobody can trust the farm is even genuine. So everybody goes and measure. So what's the cost of that? So we'll collect. This is why we realized the cost of bank account opening was 200 rupees, 150, 200 rupees, and cost of mutual fund account opening in India was 1,500 rupees, $20 roughly. Now, 5-6 years later, post Aadhaar, eKYC, and so on, but before COVID itself, the cost of that had plummeted from 1,500 rupees to 15 rupees. And bank account opening had plummeted from 150 rupees to 1.5 rupees. Okay. So literally, it's not an order of one reduction. Now so what we look for, Ritesh, is very key. This is why we have a very, very simplistic model of thinking. I don't complicate my life at all. Okay. Because it is multidimensionally complex. Societal problems are multidimensional. We see education, children in the school trying to teach some triangle geometry, basic geometry to a child. He's not even eaten. That girl is not even eaten in the morning. There's no sugar in her body. There is nothing. Maybe night also she was starving. So is it a healthcare problem, nutrition problem, or education problem, right? No, these are all multidimensionally complex problems. So if you try to solve it, infrastructure builders will get absolutely confused about everything. Infrastructure builders should ask very, very basic question. What is the necessary building blocks we must do, without which we will not see economic growth? We will not see progress coming, right? Solve them. And as you solve them, always say that when I solve those, I always have the first adopters of it lined up and starting to use it. Then you solve the next necessary condition and the next and next. And eventually, the last set of people who is trying to solve the real farmer problem will say, now for me to give a lending to a farmer, I can do what I used to take 20 days to do manual paper processing. And it will cost me, including some surveyor, some 5,000 rupees cost or whatever, doing all the background checking of all the data this farmer is producing before I can offer the lending offer. Now is plummeted to 2 hours. And the cost has plummeted. Instead of 5,000 rupees, is like 50 rupees. And suddenly that allows me to be high trust, low cost, high volume environments. Without that, we are absolutely sure we'll get some 100 farmers will get it eventually, but not everybody can get it. Same thing reason happening why SME lending is not happening in India. It's easier for a large factory company or a multi-billion 1,000 crore company to get a 15,000 crore loan. It's so much easier than a 10 lakh revenue making SME to get a 50,000 rupee loan. They can't get it. It's not because banks are not interested in giving. I can't trust anything you are saying. And the cost of trust and cost of verification and cost of paperwork and cost of background check is so high that giving 50,000 rupees and charging 12% interest, my cost is more than interest I'm going to earn. If the cost is more than interest I'm going to earn, because you're not going to take a 15-year loan. SMEs take 2-week loan, okay, 3-week bridge loan. What is the interest you can get? But the cost of dealing with you is so much high that I would rather say no. It's not economically viable. So the idea is to dramatically reduce cost, increase trust by building what called necessary building block and getting early adopters going. So I would not ask any of those questions. I would ask very, very basic questions.
Colleague of mine recently introduced me this word called bus list. I don't know if you've heard of the bus list, which is if this person falls under a bus, then the company fails. Apparently, that's the bus list. So every company has a bus list of people saying, hey, these people fall under a bus, then the company is shut down. So, and we have to keep the bus list as, as large as possible so there's sufficient people. What is the bus list of a DPI thinking in India today? And I'm hazarding a guess that it's a very small number. Because there are so many people thinking solutions, very few people thinking infrastructure. And given where we are today, that it's demonstrated value, it clearly solves problems at scale much faster than anything else. Geo success story, all of that. We need to have a much larger group of people who are thinking infrastructure, who are funding this thinking. But it is not the case today. Is a hazard. I guess I'm hazarding. How do we change that, Pramod?
Just before we go there is significant confusion about DPI versus simply digitization. For example, government would say, "Oh, we have created national, carrier portal, or carrier service portal for the blue collar job portal," and they would say that it's a DPI. And our argument is that DPI has two characteristics. One, it is not a solution. It is a building block. Second, it is a building block that gets used by someone else outside. If you're building a whole portal, whole database, whole solution, whole processes, whole thing, you are digitizing. I'm okay with that. Nothing wrong. But you are digitizing a solution. Don't call it a DPI, because next person will rebuild all that all over again. Same blue collar workers in labor ministry will do the same thing. Some other ministry will do the same thing. Education and skill ministry will do the same thing. Everybody has another career portal or another skill portal going on. So the real question about is that infrastructure is not trying to solve anything. It distributes other people's ability to solve it faster, cheaper. And then the real measure that way is it a building block, one building block that is cross-cutting across use cases? Second, is that building block used by others when it get launched, other adopters who are using in diverse scenarios, right? If these two are, you are truly building reusable digital public infrastructure, DPIs as building blocks. So this is point one. Second, the bus list, you're right. This is new. I mean, as the way of thinking is new. India has been practicing for a while, but even there, I would say only a handful of people, some of us been there. So, some of us may be part of that bus list. And it is important that we spread and improve the understanding of what DPIs and DPI thinking is. DPI thinking is not about building some software. It's a way of unbundling and way of looking at +1 adoption, way of getting market making, way of creating ecosystem to use it. Aadhaar by itself was so simple. It had 4 attributes and 2 APIs, right? That's all. But we did at what scale? And then we got banks to open, do the mutual funds to use it, SEBI to use it, benefits transfer to use it. Nothing to do with the identity authority. Same as payment. Payment as a rail is used by many, whether it's government is paying, salaries are paid, B2B payments are going on, B2C merchant payments are going on, subscription payments, IPO subscription, gifting, all kinds of things are happening on bill payments are all happening on top of. But payment is just a reusable building block out there. It moves money in a guaranteed way and between two parties, right? So this thinking is not obvious, but it's been done before. So I would think that if you put our mind to it, we can get few practitioners quite easily. There are already few practitioners in India. There are few practitioners around the world. It's not India phenomenon alone. There are few definitely on the identity and payments. There are enough examples. whether it's Singapore, Thailand, or whether it's Estonia's efforts, smaller countries, nevertheless, they all have taken effort. PIX in Brazil, or folks in Ethiopia, or folks in a few other African countries are really doing good job about trying to build some basic infrastructure. But actually, when you look at many of the countries claiming that we have done, what they have done is we have digitized. Doesn't mean it's DPI. So you have to ask the question, how many API calls? It's a very good way to ask is how many people are using that specification or API calls? How many in diverse cases? If that, then you have a DPI going. Otherwise, you have a good digitization going. That's what will happen. We are as part of we just announced a center for DPI in IIIT Bangalore. And I also heard there will be more centers like this will come up. And it may not be, we don't want it to be exclusive center. Let there be more centers. For example, I'm very sure you, in your capacity, will talk about DPI to the funders and DPI, how to think about it, how to create separate funding exercises as an infrastructure, and how do you measure infrastructure slightly different from impact measurement, which they are used to. How do they carry their brand, because a philanthropy brand, they still want to show it up. So how do their care, such as brand, get solved in infrastructure funding use case? Some of that you will discuss. So you will discuss funding, somebody will discuss policies, people like us will discuss design and architecture, and somebody else will look at human use cases, the field studies, to understand early results and what worked and what didn't work, and how do you improve this system more and more. I think everybody has to basically understand this. DPI thinking is not simply going and digitizing or throwing tech guys at it. It is a way of leveraging technology and creating reusable building blocks that creates exponential solutioning by someone else. Others can now build faster, cheaper, because you build the underlying foundations in one sense. You build all the infrastructure in one sense. That's why it's called infrastructure, correctly so. Second point you have to understand is that it does not cost money. And then recently said that very well. DPI thinking, DPI commitment does not take deep pockets, it takes deep conviction. That's what he said to all the finance ministers. It was brilliant, saying that it is about way of thinking. It's about wanting to create interoperability, underlying rails, and create innovators' excitement and the energy to be able to eventually solve. Because we will create enough problems for humanity that we will not run out of problems. So we'll have enough problems to solve. But ideas to do necessary conditions. There's some necessary. Should people own their data? Should people have bank account? Should people have it in the digital world? Should they have a digital identity that they can prove, successfully instead of paper? Should some common open data should come out as public goods like healthcare open data and sanitation or urban open data instead of getting locked in? Should it be a public good? Should we get it out? I think there are some basic stuff we must do, and we should just do it and trust the fact that when you create reusable building blocks, innovators will surprise you and find mechanism. But the good thing is with philanthropy, though, is that if they fund both sides, infrastructure side and this, then you can even sometimes fast track the infrastructure usage. Because you could also say, with this infrastructure, I am funding a program to leverage that infrastructure and actually to solve in a different, faster way. But doesn't mean others can't use it. Others can also use it similarly. So they can set an example also, saying that how to build infrastructure and how to leverage infrastructure to solve something faster and at scale. And when you do this, I think it is important that we continue to build local capacity. We are also creating global DPI residence program in the IIIT-B through people who can immerse in the design every day, like an apprenticeship, and become a natural practitioner of the idea of DPI. Not everybody has to need, this is not a tech problem. Tech can be, somebody will solve the tech. How to implement is easy. What to implement and why to implement is the hard part. That's what Nandan always says, you can't outsource thinking. So you need people who are in the thick of it, truly as a partner to various governments, to say how to think about it and how to get this out. And once you can get why and what, you can outsource the how. How to build it up.
And in my mind, I'm going to frame this slightly differently, Pramod, and put a hypothesis. I think 4 things are necessary for this to become a movement, in some sense, where a lot of people are doing it, right? One is people who can design what needs to be. We need more Pramod Varmas, in some sense. And there, your idea of going to IIIT-B is useful because in my mind, I'm also thinking it's far more intuitive for the new people who come out of the program to think like this rather than existing architects to change their mind. It's very hard. That's one, which is the design experts who are coming in. The second are the funding sources. And there, as you rightly said, organizations like Satwa that understand the funding constraint should combine the funding constraint with the value that is here, make a package that then is able to sell it, build a community of funders, etc. The third is the ecosystem, the policy, etc. And honestly, I think what the community around EkStep and others have done is to make this politically viable today. And I think there is state level work that needs to happen now at different states so that this becomes a movement. I think for me, all these three seem solvable. The fourth point is for me, entrepreneurship. The political entrepreneurship to get the ecosystem coming on top of it, governments to come on top of it, etc. I struggle with that. I feel like that's the hardest constraint to solve. And honestly, once you solve for entrepreneurship, it's easier to solve for funding because funders support entrepreneurs and so on. Ecosystem trusts the entrepreneur. Do you see that as a problem as well? Is that a big constraint in your mind?
Yeah, see, there is always time for everything. India is very lucky to have all four firing, okay, in one sense. Few countries are also that way, you'll see. All four reasonably starting to work well. But some countries you may not have a mature entrepreneurial ecosystem. In that case, you can't import everything, but might turn into a struggle. But sometimes I think all three are equally troublesome, according to me. All four are equally hard. I think design in one sense is easy. What I do is easy as long as your political alignment and if you have, absolute excitement in that country that we must do it, people are inspired, rallying behind it, then we can actually come and, it's not so difficult to unbundle something and figure it out what to do. And then we can get more practitioners there. It's not a big deal. We actually find both political and bureaucratic alignment because they are naturally short-term oriented. They may not be amenable to understanding what's going on. That is one issue we face. And the bureaucrats, a lot of times, departments or ministries don't collaborate naturally with other ministries and departments. So you will see a lot of silos in the government because of this. And some of that is continued to be a struggle. An entrepreneur, I agree with you that if there is missing piece of the puzzle, and then you get policy readiness, infrastructure readiness, but there's no innovator. There's nobody to innovate. But I have a way out though. As two things I find this useful. Aadhaar was not, frankly, a full entrepreneurial story initially. Aadhaar's first big adopter was government and regulated bodies like Reserve Bank of India and banks, right? Using. So you don't need entrepreneurial unless you start doing this more and more. My takeaway is two. One, every country needs one success story that they can boast about. Success breeds success. Success builds belief. The only reason India is repeating this again and again and again and again, today it seems to be quite a casual way we're organizing, and everything they rename it with the U in the middle, the U in the beginning. UID started UPI, and then now UHI, unified everything. We want unified everything, something to do with you, right? Because all this comes from those fundamental that once we believe, the belief that sets into the society that we can, then like Obama campaign, we can, the belief comes in, we can, we tend to do more and more. So it is important every country takes the first success. And the success, that one success, orchestrating that one success in their context, that changes their societal and political belief and bureaucratic belief is very, very key. If you can get one thing going, you will be surprised how much we can breed again. Only reason of Aadhaar, we launched eSign and DigiLocker because Ram Sevak Sharma went from here to MeitY secretary in 2014 after his stint in UIDI. He said, okay, now I believe this something can happen, something big can happen. And Pramod, okay, what can we think about? We seem to have an IT Act, but nobody uses digital signature. Then I wrote the eSign paper. Then I wrote the DigiLocker paper, how to credentialize and all that thing. Because I was thinking about certificates are everywhere. We love certificates. We love photocopies of certificate. We love everything about certificates in this country. So we were thinking that what if we can, make it verifiable? simply remove. That was a beginning of DigiLocker, right? So now we are doing credentialing at scale, vaccine credentialing. Everything is verifiable for us now. So I think there is that we have to get that first success now. So that is key. Second point I want to say is that don't necessarily wait for entrepreneurs to step in. Look for one or two killer use cases. Even government sometimes can be the biggest innovator. And because government can also, they are one of the biggest machineries in one sense, right? They have, they although they believe they can't, they can. Sometimes they can overdo also. So it's very important that the power they have is enormous to pull something off. So if they really want bank account for everybody, they will make it happen. You'll be surprised how much they can do. God. So the question is that can we align with the big intent at the political leadership level to align that to say, let's use this DPI at least for our own sake. For example, you build the road. Private cars are not there. Car companies are missing. Car company importing is too costly. Even if it's imported, people can't afford. But nothing is stopping you from running public transport. So you can think of how to induce initial usage by government itself or regulated entities. Not a big deal at all. We can absolutely do. DigiLocker, that's why we saw. CBSC was early user. Driver license department. Only private companies are still not depositing enough in the DigiLocker. I still feel we are there actually behind in credentialing. Like your salary certificates. So we are not making salary certificate verifiable. We are not making your employee certificates verifiable. They are still in paper certificates we give to whomsoever concerned. Yeah, Ratish works in this company type of situation, right? Today we give it because sometimes we have to show it to the bank or to the rental agreement or whatever. We have to do all that thing. But they're all paper. Why is it not DigiLocker? You'll be surprised. Actually, government uses DigiLocker more than the private uses DigiLocker. So you don't have to wait for entrepreneurial ecosystem is my second point. So you have way out. I think you have ways out of this thing.
I have a couple of observations and I also have a couple of closing remarks as well. Pramod, I think two things. One, it's very amusing when you say what you're doing is easy. It fits into my mental model that whenever we do something, we find it is easier to do. I actually think what you do is very difficult. And I think now that it comes to you so naturally, it sort of seems easy. But creating people who think like this, I think has to be an education process. Like we have to sort of build for institution. And second is, I think the point on entrepreneurs is fully taken. And even with the government, PDS becoming millet's first customer enables millet adoption. Absolutely. But I do also believe that there needs to be an entrepreneur for the infrastructure also. Like if Nandan hadn't pushed as an infrastructure entrepreneur, I don't think we would have reached. So that even an infrastructure entrepreneur is important as just an innovation entrepreneur. I have so much more to ask you. I wanted to ask you about industry adoption in general. I was talking to R.S. Sharma recently. He was talking about how there should be more industry adoption. Wanted to talk to you about sectors, but I guess
there are enough architects and engineers. By the way, even Rati, you as an engineer who's may not be a practicing engineer, if we have few hours of conversation, you might say, oh, this is how I came up with, but the Pramod just shifted my change, man. After that, you can do. You don't need me. It's about just getting this piece and like necessary. When I told you necessary, I think very differently. You say, of course, we always think it is complicated problem solving, not simplified infrastructure solving, right? So few things are good enough to trigger, and that's why we see more and more architects starting to do. So reason why I said it's easy, because a lot of times simple mentorship and guidance is good enough to get the people going. Half the time we don't know what to ask and what to do. How is easy part, right? So that conversation is easy. Second, on the private companies, I think it's a journey. At the end of the day, it's only 10 years. Into our 10, 12 years into, really until 2012, even Aadhaar was barely known, right? Other than some early news about Nandan coming there or whatever. Nobody really understood the full impact of it. So we really just a decade. We did so much in a decade, we are impatient. Okay, and we see this saying, when I say this happens, in Digitatra or some conversation on Twitter, they would say, oh, but this is not there. And people, I always tell them, patience is a virtue. It takes time. Infrastructure, adoption, behavioral change, societal level, at large scale change, it takes time. Even private companies, you'll be surprised, although we always feel private companies are faster innovators. Not necessarily so. Sometimes government is equally fast to innovate. which is why we should not shy away from saying, if there's no private, we'll also start innovating on government can also innovate. Regulated entities can innovate, although they might come across slow to you. And startups might naturally sound like faster people, but actually when startups are slow, UPI, when we saw that, how many startups we had to struggle to convince them why UPI. In Koramangala, we couldn't convince the 5 startups to join UPI. And the 2 years later said, oh, okay, you didn't tell me. What do you mean you didn't? We've been telling you. Like from day one, we were writing spec, right? We were telling you. Few companies like PhonePe jumped in the wagon, but others didn't. So you will see the standard curve of people who early adopters, and then of course the late majority all the way going. And I would think every such cycle has it, same adoption curve you will start seeing. And industry today, if you go back, I did a NASCOM session and all that thing with private industry. They seem to be very, very much ready to start to leverage it, start to build, start to talk about to their customers in other countries. They're starting to do all that thing. Until then, they thought, oh, it's something with, Digital India thing going on here, right? They can see the value, but they don't know what to do. They don't know what it means to them. Now we are saying, no, everything, there's a significant thing you can do, even in your own everyday life, to be able to push the idea of digital as a lever to be able to actually dramatically reduce the cost of access, cost of trust, and cost of engagement at large. So that just reduce it, so that we meet the necessary condition. After that, if you give all the help, today we have rich people, money is not a problem. Educated people, so rich educated people being unhealthy. Very, very bad habit, eating chips in front of the sofa type of situation, right? Who saying, you're more educated guys, money is not an issue. Why are you unhealthy? So sometimes, it's just by giving education, by giving access doesn't mean it'll actually solve the problem. Like, just to close it out, a few days back, some journalists asked me, does Digital India actually solve poor people's problem? I said, oh my God, no, I think we'll create enough problems for ourselves forever, perpetuity. But not doing it would have been a disaster for us. We would have never moved on to a equitable economic growth without people having identity, bank account, access to education. Doesn't mean they will learn. Access to business opportunity doesn't mean they will do a good business. Access to lending, access to capital, doesn't mean everybody will do it, use it well. But necessary condition has to be met. Sufficiency, God knows. Hopefully we'll collectively do a good job. Who knows?
Pramod, it's such a joy to talk to someone who deeply understands the topic, right? And I've loved engaging. I can speak for another hour, like I said, but thank you so much for your time. I hope everyone enjoys the conversation as much as I did. For me, truly, 2 things happened today. One is, like you said, that there's a science behind designing infrastructure. It seems abstruse from outside, but when you step in and you're able to do it as an iterative process, it makes sense. And 2 is, I'm actually more excited about what is ahead of us and what we have done. I think, like you said, picture abhi baki hai, and this has only been 10 years, and so we have a long way to go. And that sense of optimism is a fantastic note to close on. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to meeting you again soon.
Thank you, Radhi. It's been a wonderful conversation. As you said, we could have talked forever, but I don't think anybody wants to listen that long. So we better wind up. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us here on Decoding Impact. We hope you enjoyed this episode and the conversation with our expert. To learn more about Sattva Knowledge Institute and our evidence-based insights, follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram, and explore our content on our website, all linked in the description.